Okay, how's it going, everybody? First off, sorry again for not getting a lecture out last week. Just had some stuff I was dealing with. Um, but I'm back this week. Wanted to get this video out, talk about some things. First off, just as a quick reminder, your first short writing assignment is going to be due at the end of this week. The prompt is up under the week 3 folder. If you have any questions at all about that one, I know it's maybe a little different than what you're used to, there's a lot to it, but I hope it was at least clear, kind of what I'm hoping to get you to do. If you do have any questions about that at all, let me know. And also just, have some fun with it. All right. Please don't stress out too bad about this one. That wasn't, I know I put a lot in there, but that wasn't my intention to make it seem super stressful. Um, I wanted to give you something interesting to do that I think is going to help in the long run as we start to think about research and academic writing. I think that can be helpful. So, have some fun with it. As far as grading goes, I know I didn't put this in an announcement or anything yet, but as long as I can see that you put some effort in, that you did the thing, and that you're not just doing the bare minimum, you're probably won't get any lower than a B. Okay, that's usually how I grade these things. If I can see that you put the time in, if I can see that you're doing the work, you get a B. I want to give out A's. I really do. I like, rewarding hard work and you know, um, so that's kind of that. If you just kind of half-ass it, you might get lower than a B. But as long as you do the thing, you get at least a B. Okay. Um, so there's that. Um, let's see. So that again, any other questions? I'm happy to talk it over if you need any help with it. But in the meantime, I do want to talk about analyzing a text, and one aspect of that is style. So let's talk about style. Um, Now, this is style is something that I am interested in. This is kind of where my research lies as a graduate student, um, and so I'm hoping to kind of give you some ideas for the kinds of things you can look for when you're analyzing a text. So this is kind of building on what they talked about in your book in chapter 2. I'm just going to try to add a little bit to this. Um, Now, if I were to ask you what you think about style, I would guess that your first thought might be clothes, right? Fashion. Um, if a person is really well dressed or they present themselves well, we can say that they have a sense of style. And again, it's not just dress; it could be, makeup, hairstyle, you know. But that is, it could just be me, but that's usually where your head goes when you think about style. Um, but then there's other ways that you could think about it. Anything that has to do with like design, right? I mean, that's why a lot of Apple products became so popular is because of their design style. Um, Different cars have style. You know, you can talk about like movies or music or food, whatever it is, right? If something is noticeable or aesthetically pleasing, we could say that it has a sense of style. Um, but as far as like clothes go, think about what your clothing style or your personal style does. Um, the choices a person makes about the way they dress can communicate certain things to others. Your style can be an extension of your personality or your identity, and people can make assumptions about you simply by the style that you present. Now, whether that's fair or not, we're not going to get into that, but you know, um, the way that you present yourself to the world can tell people about you, or people can make judgments about you based on that. And that's without ever getting to know you, right? Um, but there is some connection between what you enjoy or the styles that you like and kind of the way you I guess, your identity inside you. If that makes sense? Now I find this really interesting because we're going to talk about writing styles, and I think that there are a lot of comparisons between the way that we think about style in other areas and the way that it works in, when we actually talk about writing. Um, so when we talk about style in this class or in writing in general, we're talking about the surface level of writing. So much like how your sense of style when we talk about the way someone dresses or presents themselves, it's kind of the surface, right? It's the first thing that you see or the first thing that you notice. Um, I've said before that we can make a difference between, or a distinction between, what a text says, which is its content, and what it does, which is the rhetoric. Style is an extension of rhetoric, particularly how the surface level affects an audience. So when I say the surface level of writing, that refers to things like word choice, sentence structure, organization, basically the things that you can see, right? It's how the language works together to influence a reader. Okay. Um, so here's an example that's going to kind of show you how different styles um, change the way or can have an effect on a reader. So let's say that you want to send an email to a professor asking them to post your grade for the last test that you took. Let's say the professor's slacking and isn't uploading your grade, and you want to know what you got, right? Now, there's many different ways that you could write this email, right? You're going to have certain choices to make as far as what you want to say, right? How you put this email together. And the choices that you make help determine the way that the email is received, right? It has an effect on the person that you're writing to, in this case, your professor. So here's an example. Dear Professor Wallace, this is Janae from your English 1303 class. I hope you are doing well. I just wanted to ask about the grades for our latest test. Last week you mentioned that grades would be available by yesterday, but I still don't see mine. Am I looking in the wrong place? I'm very sorry to bother you, but I am very nervous about the test results. I really like this class and I want to do well in it. I appreciate any help you can give. Regards, Janae. Now, we can notice some things about this, right? Janae is doing what we talked about. She's asking the professor about her test grade, but notice some certain things about the way that she asks, right? Um, you notice how she introduces herself. This is Janae. I hope you are doing well. So she's, asking about how the professor is doing first. I just wanted to ask about grades for our latest tests. Notice how she says something like, am I looking in the wrong place? That shifts the blame to her instead of on the professor. So you can see this is like a very polite, very nice way to ask, right? And you also notice like the kind of distinction in power between the professor and the student. The student is, trying to take the blame off of the professor and put it onto her. Am I looking in the wrong place? Or I'm very sorry to bother you, um, and the way that she words this, the way that she puts this email together, helps to create this very respectful tone, right? And you're not demanding things from this professor, you're humbly asking, right? And so again, just by the way this is written, we can kind of get a sense for the tone, for the personality, for the sort of way she's trying to present herself to this professor, right? And so one way to make this more clear is if we say, okay, well, what if we were to write this a different way? Hey, professor, I know you mentioned grades would be out by now, but I can't find mine. Can you tell me what I got on the test? Thanks, Trevor. And sorry about the little error here. In this case, Trevor's asking the same thing, but it's much more brief and it's much less formal, right? Instead of dear professor, right, we have hey professor. Okay, different levels of formality. Whereas Janae is really trying to make sure that the professor or that she's not blaming the professor. uh, Trevor just kind of skips out altogether. I can't find mine. Okay, I guess he does kind of put that on himself as well. Um, but it's just much more, much shorter, much more succinct, a lot less formal. You get the impression that maybe Trevor has a better relationship with this professor, or they're more friendly, I guess. Um, but just by the way this is written, you can see that there's kind of a different presentation going on here. Now let's try something else. Professor, last week you informed us that our grade for the exam would be posted by now, but mine still isn't posted. I find this unacceptable. Students need to be informed of how they are doing in your class. They can manage their schedules accordingly. You hold us accountable for deadlines but can't meet them yourself? Please post my grade as soon as possible. Sincerely, Alan. Now, we can say that this is quite a bit different, right? This is when we talk about tone, right? Tone is like the feeling that we get from this, right? And we could say that this has a very hostile tone, maybe, very accusatory, um, and standoffish, I guess. And whereas Janae was very respectful, this one is not, right? Uh, with the professor and the Janae email, we can see that there's definitely a power differential there. And in this one, this student, if there is the same power differential, this student isn't very worried about it, right? Um, and so this is well written. This is um, still it's still formal, right? He's using words like sincerely, but it's definitely not as respectful as the first one, right? Or as friendly as the second one, right? A different tone is created because of the words that the student chooses to use. Um, Here's one more example. Yo, teach, grade my shit by Sarah. um, this one's very to the point. This one's very brief and gets the message across, right? We still know that the student is missing the grade, um, but a lot of the other stuff is left out, and it's not respectful at all or very much appropriate. So, again, we can see through the choices that Sarah makes how we can judge things about the way that the student you know as far as like how they're presenting themselves professionally, or not very professionally in this case. um, Now each of these examples, you they they are different, right? Like they're saying different things. They're The content of the email for the most part is at least similar, right? They're all asking about you know getting a grade for their test, but the way that they do it is very different. And in part, like, yes, they are saying different things, but they also are um, saying similar things in very different ways, right? And so this is kind of what we mean when we talk about style. Style and content are related. So even though those emails have similar content, the content does change because they are using different styles, or different words, different language, different sentence structures. Like, these things are changing between these emails, and that changes what's being said. So as that example shows, the way you say something is just as important as what you are saying. Style and content are interrelated in that respect. We can't really separate them, but we can think about them separately for the purpose of analysis. One way, again, I like to think about it is style is like the surface level, and content is like the core of what you're talking about. Um, every piece of writing has style. Some styles are meant to stand out, while others are meant to disappear. By that I mean, just sometimes I hear people say, like, oh, well, this doesn't really have a style. And it's like, yes, everything has a style. It just means it might be kind of similar to the expected style, I guess. um, so what I mean by that is something called the crystal goblet theory. Now this was a theory of of typography, which is like the study of how you make like text, like the actual typeface. So, somebody has to design, or somebody did design, like the letters that you type or the fonts that you use on Microsoft Word, right? Or that are printed in the books that you read. Somebody designs those typefaces, right? And there's a study of what makes for a good typeface. Now, one of these was called the Crystal Goblet, and what this says is that a good font or a good typeface should be like a crystal goblet. And what that means is that it's transparent. You can see, it's elegantly designed, but it's still meant to not be noticed, right? You're supposed to notice the wine or whatever that you're drinking inside of it. Whereas like a very fancy goblet would take all attention away from the content, from the message that's being transmitted. And you can see in this example here, you know, this would be like a crystal goblet where it's transparent and you can see straight through to what the text is saying. This one, the attention goes to the goblet itself. You can't really read what's behind it. Okay. And this is kind of, how we can think about style, right? Some styles are meant to be noticed. When we talk about something like poetry, for example, the structure, right? The things that you're doing with language, they're meant to be noticed, right? They're meant to be seen, right? Same thing with something like music, right? You're meant to listen to the raps, like the rhymes, right? You're meant to listen to how these words play off of each other, right? The linguistic wordplay is just as interesting as what the actual or like what the message of the song is, right? Whereas with prose, and especially like academic prose, many times we take the opposite approach where it's just you're meant to do what's expected. Now sometimes this goes too far, at least in my opinion, where many times teachers or tests or whatever it is will tell you that there's only one correct way to write, and I don't really I don't really ascribe to that. I think that as a writer you have choices about what goes on the page, and the only determination of whether or not it's good is how the audience reacts to it, right? And so when we talk about things like APA or MLA, these often, when we talk about style, a lot of times we're talking about like, okay, what does the APA or the MLA style say? And these are like handbooks that'll tell you how you're supposed to write. Now these things are absolutely useful, especially when it comes to citation. There's a reason that we have some of these like uniform ideas about style, right? They kind of help us all, work within the same framework. However, if we take this kind of idea too far, I do think that it restricts what's possible, right? It restricts a student's creativity, and it. To be frank, it makes writing boring. If everybody writes exactly the same way, and there's never any chance for innovation or creativity or just kind of variation, things get dull. And so that's kind of why I have such an interest in style, is that it really helps us to make writing interesting and enjoyable to read. So all right, all that aside, what can we look at when we're analyzing style? As I said before, style has to do with things like word choice. So your book mentions the difference between denotation and connotation, right? Denotation is more like the dictionary definition, right? It's specifically what the word means. Connotation is what a word implies, right? So if a word carries some kind of emotional weight or baggage, we can call that the connotation. A good example of this actually happened back in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina. The Associated Press, or I forget exactly who did this, but they put out, articles where pictures of a black person who was, gathering supplies after a flood. They called it looting, right? They basically said this person was looting a grocery store in New Orleans. Um, but when accompanying a picture of two white people, it said two residents wade through chest deep water finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. And so, it could be argued that both of these words apply, but looting carries a much more negative connotation, right? Looting is something that, is could be considered criminal behavior, or, at the very least, it's not something that, is socially acceptable. Whereas finding is much more of an innocent sounding word, right? Finding doesn't really have the same sort of negative connotation as looting does. Um, so I know this is a very like extreme example, um, but I picked it so that it's noticeable, right? So that you can see this. But, you know, in any kind of news headline, or especially with like clickbait and stuff like that, they will use words that carry connotations. I mean, all you really have to do to see examples of this is pick any news story and go see how CNN is handling it versus how Fox News or something is handling it, right? They going to pick different words to present the same information by using these charged words that will kind of spin based on whatever idea they're trying to get across, right? And that's through using things like the different connotations of words. Um, so here's something that I don't think your book talks about, but I wanted to talk a bit about noun style versus verb style. So in addition to just like the individual words that you choose, we can also analyze the types of words an author use. For example, we might look at whether an author is using a noun style or a verb style. By this, what I mean is that if we take a piece of text, right, and if we were to um, count up how many nouns versus how many verbs are being used, right, or how many adjectives the are in the text, we can see that that kind of has an effect on how we the kinds of like feelings that it gives off, right? So an example of this is they've done you know research on stuff like this where they'll take a piece of literature, um, and they'll ask people, okay, like what kind of tone do you think this is, or how does this make you feel, and then they go through and they'll actually count up the words, and if something has a lot of verbs in it, it tends to be a lot more active, right? And so what we can tell from that is, you know, this is something where we can point to the actual writing and say, okay, well, this is how a writer is creating a certain effect, right? Um, so verbs are action words, right? That's what it does. When writing includes a lot of them, things are happening. Action is taking place. A noun style, by contrast, is much more about stasis. Things aren't happening, they just kind of are. Um, and so here's kind of a brief example of the difference between the two. There's the famous I came, I saw, I conquered. In a noun style, that might be arrival, reconnaissance, victory. Now you'll notice two things. One, they aren't really about action, it's referring to kind of like a state of being. And two, the person or the actor is left out, right? It's no longer about this I, it's just a thing is happening, right? Or a thing happened. So there's kind of a difference in the way that those communicate information. Here's an example of a noun style. In response to the issue of equality for educational and occupational mobility, it is my belief that a system of inequality exists in the school system. Now, you've probably heard writing like this before or read writing like this before. This is pretty standard when we talk about this bureaucratic kind of prose. Sometimes this happens a lot in academic writing. Depends on the field you're getting into. Um, but you know, bureaucratic prose is legal prose. Um, anytime you want to sound very official, right? You might be using a kind of noun style like this. Now, a noun style doesn't just mean that there are a lot of nouns, it means that the sentence is constructed using a string of prepositions and a form of the verb to be. By the way, I know I'm getting a little too heavy on the grammar. Sorry about that. I don't care if you like memorize these terms or know all these grammar words. I honestly don't. Um, I wanted to just kind of introduce this to you so you can see how language is working, right? Again, I don't care if you remember what noun style means, but I want you to start thinking about language in different ways, right? My goal with this is to show you how the words that you choose can have an effect on the way that the information you're writing about is received by an audience, right? And this is one way that happens, right? So, how would we describe this type of writing, right? This example right here. In response to the issue of equality for educational and occupational mobility, it is my belief that a system of inequality exists in the school system. It's pretty dull, right? It might be very dry or what would we say, stuffy, dense, maybe. Uh, you know, when we use kind of informal terms to describe writing, we can then go in and see, okay, well, what makes it that way? Why does that make us feel the way that it does, right? If you agree that it feels dense. To me, this seems pretty dense, right? I think that would be one way to describe it. It's certainly not fun to read, right? This isn't going to be a page-turning novel or anything like that, right? It's going to be something that, if you're assigned to read this for a class, you're going to be falling asleep through it, right? At least that's how I would feel. So if we break this down, right, if we take this same sentence and we break it down, this is what I mean by prepositions. Okay, prepositions are words like in, to, of, for, of, in, right? And then we look, so we notice that there are a lot of prepositions in this, right? In response to the issue of equality for educational and occupational mobility, it is my belief that a system of inequality exists in the school system, right? So there's a lot of prepositional phrases. Now, if we look at verbs, right, where are the, this is just an example from this book, that's all. If we look for verbs, right, we say, okay, what is going on in the sentence, right? What's actually happening? What action is taking place? The only thing that we can see is, right? And as I said, it's some form of the verb to be is that's how, noun style sentences are constructed. Is they usually revolve around some kind of verb like is or are or to be. Usually it's is. And so nothing is really happening, right? When you use a verb like this, it just is, right? But if we were to say, okay, well, what action is taking place, right? Like, what is a sentence about? What is happening in this sentence? Well, then we can say my belief, right? Belief is, a form of the verb to believe, right? So we could say this person believes something, right? That's kind of where the action is taking place. Someone is believing something else. And so this is kind of why we call it a noun style, is because instead of using that verb, believe or to believe, we turn believe into belief, a noun. And we use the only verb that we use is to be, right? So if we were to turn this into a sentence that used a verb style, right, where the action is being shown, how might we do that? Right? So instead of in response to the issue of equality for educational and occupational mobility, it is my belief that a system of inequality exists in the school system. Okay, turn that into a verb style. I believe gender inequality exists in schools. Okay, this becomes that. And now, obviously, some information is left out. Uh, but do we really need it? Maybe. Is it super important? Does this get the idea across? Yeah. I believe gender inequality exists in schools. Now, you notice that belief, or sorry, action is taking place, right? Somebody's doing something. You'll also notice that this is a lot shorter. This is 9 words instead of 26. And if we were to try to include everything, maybe that would, maybe the verb style would be a little bit longer. But for the most part, we've gone through and examined this. Noun styles are a lot more, or are usually a lot longer than verb styles, right? It takes more words to say the same thing, or to say a variation of the same thing. And so this is something that we can look at. Okay, if writing, or if a piece of writing, a piece of text, if it feels very dense or stuffy, or very dry, I guess, we might look for these things. We might say, okay, well, why does it feel that way? Why does it feel like nothing's happening? And that might be because it's a noun style and there aren't very many verbs. Whereas this is much shorter, probably easier to read. So yeah, this sort of thing makes a difference. Now again, you don't have to know what noun and verb styles are, but I thought it's interesting to point out stuff like this, right? Where the sort of those feelings that you get about writing or about reading, that you get kind of in the back of your head, can be traced to things like word choice. Okay. So noun styles often turn verbs into nouns. They hide actions, right? So to indicate becomes an indication. To avoid becomes avoidance. To argue becomes an argument. So, or even worse, argumentation. And verb styles, by contrast, show action. Consider the difference between a decision was made to versus we have decided to, right? In the first case, we don't know who the decision was made by, right? Just a decision was made. It kind of hides agency, right? It hides who's doing the thing. Versus we have decided to. There's ownership being taken. We have decided to do this, right? And so just very subtle little changes in that, does make a difference in what's being communicated or what's being expressed. Now, each of these styles have their uses, but the verb style shows action and agency. The noun style shows stasis and distance, right? And by that I mean kind of like it allows people to kind of avoid, I guess, taking ownership for a certain thing. That's why, anytime you've ever seen like a business PR department or any kind of like company memo or something like that, they'll use this kind of noun style as a way to kind of distance themselves from taking responsibility from something, or at least that's one use of it. So yeah, just something interesting there. Let's see. Now, there's more I could go on. I don't want to give you too much. If you're interested in this kind of thing, there's plenty more that I can talk about. And there's links and stuff I can give you on this. But the other thing that we can look at when we talk about style is sentence structure. Let's move me over here. Okay. So sentence structure, when we talk about things like sentence length, sentence construction, like the way a sentence is put together, these things can have a subtle effect on the reader. They change the way that a reader reacts to what you're writing. And so here's an example, fairly famous example. You may have seen this before. This sentence has 5 words. Here are 5 more words. 5-word sentences are fine, but several together become monotonous. Listen to what is happening. The writing is getting boring. The sound of it drones. It's like a stuck record. The ear demands some variety. Now listen. I vary the sentence length and I create music. Music. The writing sings. It has a pleasant rhythm, a lilt, a harmony. I use short sentences, and I use sentences of medium length. And sometimes, when I am certain the reader is rested, I will engage him with a sentence of considerable length, a sentence that burns with energy and builds with all the impetus of a crescendo, the roll of the drums, the crash of the cymbals, sounds that say, "Listen to this, it is important." So write with a combination of short, medium, and long sentences. Create a sound that pleases the reader's ear. Don't just write words, write music. And so that's an example of how, you know, different sentence lengths or varying your sentence length can affect, how we react to a piece of writing. In the first example, the 5-word sentences, you read too many of those, you're gonna fall asleep, or if you write too many of those, your reader is gonna fall asleep. They're gonna get bored and they're not gonna care about what you have to say. Whereas in the second example, or the second half of this, the writing is much more interesting, right? And simply sentence length. He's not really changing too much else about a style. But yeah, with sentence length, it's it can help to draw the reader in. Whoops, where am I going? There we go. So your book mentions things like complex sentences, simple, complex, and compound sentences. This is all in chapter 2, so I'm not going to go over too much of that. But I did want to add some things to what the book was talking about. So there are certain things called rhetorical devices, which basically just describe different sentence structures that can kind of change how, or can kind of add to a sentence, right? It can kind of add to an idea. So here is one called chiasmus. Now this is a type of sentence which creates a very particular kind of relationship between a set of ideas. And so this is a quote by President John F. Kennedy, a very famous quote, and it says, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." Now this is a sentence that has kind of stuck around as a quote, not just because of the idea that's being expressed, but also because of the way it's being expressed. This sentence, it's memorable, and that's why a lot of the stuff was popular back in when they were. This is why we study this kind of stuff, is because it sticks into your mind, right? It is memorable. It's fun to say, right? Back before writing was really a thing, right? I mean, a lot of rhetoric comes from what we know about Greece back when things were like an oral culture, right? Before writing was really popular or even practical, right? Before a lot of people had access to writing and reading, most of language was done through speaking. And so if a poet or a politician or somebody had to give a presentation or a speech or recite a poem or whatever it was, they had to rely on things like this to have for one, so they could remember, but two, so that their words would be remembered by other people, by the people they were speaking to. And so devices like this really play on your memory. So specifically what's happening here is you can see that if we were to break this sentence in half and put it into lines, right? You can see, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And you can see how this sentence or this clause is repeated, but the order is switched. And so this creates kind of an X structure, right? And that's actually where this term gets its name. The Greek letter for X was chi, C-H-I. And so that is That's where this term gets its name. Chiasmus is from that X shape that this sentence creates. Um, let's see. There's plenty more like these. Isocolon is another term, and this is when a sentence has clauses of similar structure and length. So if or here's an example: the movie was good, serious but never merely pretentious, funny but never merely vulgar, strange but never merely weird. And so that's again, that's an interesting sentence, and if we can break it down, the movie was good, serious but never merely pretentious, funny but never merely vulgar, strange but never merely weird. So we can see that this the person who wrote this sentence is using repetition, but they're using it in such a way as to draw connections between these ideas, right? This sentence has a shape, it has a balance to it that you know um, is being used to hold these ideas together, to make them stand out, to emphasize them, right? So when you want to like emphasize something in your writing, you might use a structure like this, right? Or there's many different types of this. I got a whole book on a bunch of these. Let's see. Yeah, there's a ton of like these weird Greek names for, or sometimes Greek names, sometimes more modern names. Um, Things like what is it? Hypophora, metabasis, anadiplosis, conduplicatio. I don't even know how to pronounce some of these. Exemplum. Um, but yeah, there's just a ton of terms for different types of sentence structure. And so if you're ever interested in these, look up rhetorical figures or rhetorical devices, and you can find the whole list of different sentence structures that that people have categorized. I think this is all pretty interesting stuff. I think that these can be used to make certain things stand out, right? If you're making an argument and you want if you want to like make your main point stand out, you might use something like this to kind of make it pop, right? And so again, take notice when if you come across something that seems really well written, try to look at okay, is there something going on with the structure here, and that could be something worth analyzing. Finally, we have figurative language. So another thing that you can always look for is anytime they're using metaphorical language, and that's not just metaphor, but can also be simile or analogy. But basically, a metaphor is a technique used to compare two things which aren't really alike. The writer's using the comparison to get you to notice ways in which the two things are similar in order to emphasize or explain something. So you're not making an exact comparison, you're making a figurative comparison. For example, it's one thing to say someone is bad, but to say someone is a monster adds a certain amount of emphasis, right? Are they really a monster? Well, no. Like, they're not physically, have fangs or something like that, but they're acting like a monster, right? And that word, again, has certain connotations that, tell a lot more than, in a very short space than, what you might otherwise. So here's some examples of metaphors. The sun was a toddler, insistently refusing to go to bed. It was past 8:30 and still light. Okay, so comparing the sun to a toddler, right? And that communicates certain things about the way they were feeling, right? Conscience is a man's compass. Or I watched a girl in a sundress kiss another girl on a park bench, and just as the sunlight spilled perfectly onto both of their hair, I thought to myself, how bravely beautiful it is that sometimes the sea wants the city, even when it has been told its entire life it was meant for the shore. Okay, so there's an extended metaphor there. Now, I'm going to end this here because I've rambled on for long enough. I don't want to make you watch too long of a video. but there is a lot more to this kind of stuff. Um, there's, like, as I mentioned, there's a ton of different names for these different types of figurative language. There's more that we can talk about with style. Um, I wanted to kind of talk about, I think I might add to this later, uh, and add some stuff that has to do specifically with, um, when we're talking about websites. In fact, I think I might do that for a future lecture. Um, since you will be writing about websites, there's some pretty interesting stuff when we talk about, um, the way a website is put together. We can talk about things like uh, font and the kind of typeface they're using. Talk about colors, images, the way information is organized. Talk about things like search engine optimization is something that I've been studying recently that I think is pretty interesting. So I think there's more I might add to this kind of thing. But again, I've been talking for long enough. I'm sure if you made it this far, thank you. um, so yeah, I'll end it here. And if you have any questions about anything that I talked about, or if you want to know more about any of the things that I kind of mentioned here, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to, you know, tell you more or point you in the direction of some sources that might help you improve your writing or get you to think about writing in a different way. Okay. All right, that's it for now. See ya.